I spent my whole life building this home. Every mortgage payment, every repair, every tax, I carried them on my back with calloused hands and sleepless nights. This house isn't just bricks and wood. It holds the laughter of my late wife in the kitchen and the handprints of my children pressed into the concrete by the front step. But one morning, a letter arrived from the county office. My name was gone. The house worth nearly $900,000 was no longer mine. And the thief wasn't a stranger. It was my own daughter-in-law. I stood frozen on the porch, my fingers trembling as they traced those tiny handprints. My voice broke as I whispered to my wife's memory. Mary, we've lost everything. If your life's work could vanish overnight, stolen not by outsiders but by your own family, what would you do? Stay with me because the truth of how I fought back will shock you. The mornings in California carried a certain silence, a silence George Miller had grown accustomed to. At 73, he rose with the sun-boiled water for his black coffee and stepped out onto the porch. The scent of damp soil greeted him, along with the stubborn little lemon tree his late wife had planted decades ago. It leaned slightly now, but still bore fruit every summer. He cared for it as if it were her living memory. His house stood behind him, a two-story structure in a quiet neighborhood outside Los Angeles. It wasn't the biggest on the block, not the newest either, but to George it was priceless. Every nail, every wall carried the weight of sacrifices. He remembered the endless years of paying down the mortgage, working overtime shifts, and selling tools just to keep the bank away. When he looked at the house, he didn't see numbers. He saw his wife's laughter in the kitchen and his children's small hands pressing into wet concrete by the front step. Their handprints remained frozen in time, a reminder that this place was built on love. George lived alone now. His wife Mary had passed more than a decade earlier, leaving him with both grief and determination. He kept the house tidy, sweeping the porch, fixing squeaky doors, trimming the hedge. Neighbors waved, sometimes offered help, but George refused. Independence was his last pride. Still, nights felt longer, and sometimes he whispered to the walls as if Mary could hear him. Though his children were grown, they shaped his days in different ways. His daughter Anna was 35 and lived across the country in New York. She called every Sunday without fail. "Dad, are you drinking enough water? Did you take your blood pressure meds?" she'd ask, her voice filled with both worry and affection. George chuckled into the receiver. "Yes, doctor. Don't fuss too much. I'm still tougher than half the men on this street." Anna laughed, but he could hear the sigh beneath it. She always promised to visit more often, though work kept her tied to Manhattan. Still, her consistency brought George comfort. She loved him from afar, and he felt it in every call. His son David lived just a few miles away. At 40, David should have been his closest ally, the one who checked in, shared dinners, maybe fixed the gutters with him on weekends. But David had grown distant. He was polite enough when they met, but always distracted, always careful not to look George too long in the eyes. George sensed hesitation, as if his son carried secrets he couldn't confess. The wedge George believed was Sophia, David's wife. Sophia was 38, sharp-eyed, always polished in her words. She never raised her voice, but there was a weight in everything she said. Around George, she often smiled, yet her compliments carried a strange aftertaste, like medicine laced with poison. "Dad," she had begun during one casual visit, her tone sweet but firm. "You've worked so hard for this home. Don't you think it's time to put the deed under David's name, just to protect the family, you know? Taxes, probate, so many messy things can happen when papers aren't in order." George frowned. "I already have a will, Sophia. When I'm gone, the house will go to both Anna and David equally." She tilted her head, eyes soft yet unyielding. "Of course, but you never know. If something happens suddenly, people might contest things. Better safe than sorry." David sat beside her, silent, hands folded in his lap. George looked at his son, waiting for him to speak, but David only shifted uncomfortably, as if agreeing with his wife without daring to say it aloud. That night, George lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He trusted David, he wanted to. But Sophia's words gnawed at him. The suggestion felt less like advice and more like pressure. Weeks later, during a family dinner, the unease sharpened. Anna had flown in for a short visit, rare but precious. They sat around the dining table, plates of roast chicken and mashed potatoes, filling the air with warmth. George was grateful just to have his children under one roof again. Yet in the middle of laughter, Sophia's voice cut through like a knife. "George," she said, raising her glass with a polite smile, "we all know how much you love this house, but you've been forgetting things lately, haven't you? Bill's doctor's appointments. Maybe it's time David and I take care of the paperwork for you." The room fell silent. Anna's fork clattered against her plate. George's face stiffened, heat rising to his ears. He searched David's eyes for defense, but his son lowered his gaze, staring at the tablecloth. George forced a chuckle. "I may be old, Sophia, but I know exactly what's mine." Her smile didn't falter. "Of course. I only want what's best for the family." Anna reached for her father's hand under the table, squeezing it gently. The gesture steadied him, but the sting remained. He chewed in silence, the joy of the meal dissolved into unease. Later that evening, after Anna went to bed, George stood on the porch again, staring at the handprints in the concrete. His chest tightened. He whispered into the cool night air, "I won't let anyone take this from us." Inside, he opened the drawer where he kept his documents, the deed, his will neatly filed. He ran his hand over them like a guard over treasure. The thought circled in his mind, he must leave this house to both children no matter what anyone said. Fairness was his last gift to them. Yet deep inside, doubt gnawed at him. Sophia's words lingered like a shadow, and David's silence cut deeper than any argument. Sometimes the silence inside the house pressed too heavily on George's chest. After dinner, he would wander from room to room, touching the frames that still held family photos. In the living room hung a portrait from Christmas long ago, Anna and David grinning with candy canes in hand. Mary's arms wrapped tightly around them. George would stand there for minutes at a time, whispering, "We were happy, weren't we, Mary?" before retreating to his chair. Nights were the hardest. The house creaked and George found himself speaking aloud just to hear a voice. He read the newspaper front to back, then reread it again until the letters blurred. Sometimes he turned on the TV for company, though he barely cared for the shows. Loneliness was a steady companion, one that no neighborly wave could chase away. Anna noticed the weight in his voice, even over the phone. One evening she called just as George was locking up the back door. "Dad? You sound tired," she said gently. "Are you sleeping enough?" He laughed lightly. "Sleep comes and goes. But hearing you helps, sweetheart." "I wish I lived closer," Anna confessed. "I hate that you're alone in that big house. Promise me you'll call me if you ever feel unwell." George's throat tightened. "I promise. You may be far, Anna, but you're close in all the ways that matter." Her silence on the other end told him she was holding back tears. By contrast, his interactions with David carried a heaviness he couldn't ignore. One afternoon, George tried again, asking David, "Do you really think I should change the deed?" David hesitated, eyes darting toward the kitchen where Sophia was preparing tea. His lips parted. "Dad, But Sophia's voice floated in before he could finish. "He's just worried, George. We both are. Don't take it the wrong way." She entered the room with 2 cups, placing one firmly in David's hands. Her smile never faltered, but her presence silenced him. George leaned back, heart sinking. The son he once relied on seemed shackled by invisible chains. "If you had sacrificed your entire life for your children, how would you make sure it stayed fair? Share your thoughts." George Miller's hands had known only work. In his youth, he hauled lumber for construction crews under the California sun, the skin of his palms torn and hardened. Later, he became a mechanic, then a night shift warehouse worker when the bills piled higher than his wages. Whatever the job, he took it because there was always a mortgage waiting at the end of the month. The house on Oak Ridge Street was not just an address. It was the finish line of every grueling day. In 2008, when the economy collapsed, George came within inches of losing everything. He remembered sitting at the kitchen table with Mary, his wife, a stack of overdue notices between them. "We can't keep up," Mary whispered, her voice fraying. George pressed her hands between his. "We'll find a way." And he did. He sold his father's watch, pawned Mary's engagement ring, borrowed from friends he swore he would pay back. He worked triple shifts, sleeping in the cab of his truck during lunch breaks. When foreclosure letters came, he tore them to shreds before Mary could see. By the grace of grit, he kept the bank at bay. Mary never stopped believing in him. Even in her final months as illness drained her strength, she would smile and say, "This house is our anchor, George. Promise me you'll keep it safe for the kids." He promised, and when she passed, that promise became his religion. The walls became a chapel, the backyard a memorial garden. Every corner of the house held a memory of her laughter, her presence. George felt her there, especially at night. The children had grown up inside those walls. In the living room hung the wedding photo he and Mary took, framed with wood. George cut himself. Down the hall, Anna's old bedroom still bore faint scribbles of crayons she once scrawled on the wallpaper. George never repainted. "Let it stay," he had told Mary. "Someday she'll laugh when she sees it." David's room still carried the smell of glue from the model cars he built as a boy, trophies lining a dusty shelf. These imperfections, these remnants of childhood, were sacred to George. They were proof that his sacrifices had meant something. Anna, now 35, lived in New York City. The distance pained him, but she made up for it with devotion. Packages arrived on his doorstep, sweaters and winter vitamins, with notes scribbled in her tidy handwriting. "Take one a day, Dad. Don't skip." Birthdays never passed without a card. And every Sunday, without fail, his phone rang. "Dad, how are you feeling this week?" she would ask. "I'm still here, Anna, still breathing." "You better be," she teased, though he could hear the worry beneath. Her calls filled the silence that otherwise pressed down on him. She might be thousands of miles away, but she felt closer than the son who lived just down the road. David was different. At 40, he should have been George's right hand. But somewhere along the years, the bond had thinned. George remembered when David was a boy how he begged to go to Dodger games. George would save tips from odd jobs just to surprise him with tickets. They'd sit in the bleachers, David's face painted blue and white, shouting until his voice cracked. "This is the best day ever, Dad," he'd say. George replayed those memories, now wondering how that boy had become a man who couldn't meet his father's eyes. The distance was not measured in miles, but in silence, and George suspected the cause had a name: Sophia. Sophia had a way of controlling a room without raising her voice. She moved gracefully, every word coded in politeness, yet behind her eyes lurked calculation. To outsiders she was attentive, the kind of daughter-in-law who asked about George's health, poured his tea, reminded him to take pills. But to George, the sweetness carried barbs. She insisted on handling his mail, on helping with bills, slipping suggestions that undermined his independence. "Don't strain yourself with these forms, Dad," she'd say, sliding papers into a folder. "You don't need the stress at your age." Her tone made it sound like care, but George heard the undertone. "You're slipping. You can't manage anymore." One evening he noticed David with his phone in hand, thumb hovering over Anna's number. Before David could press call, Sophia's hand reached out, plucking the phone away. "She's busy," she said with a smile. "No need to bother her with little things." David lowered his head, conceding without a word. George watched a chill running through him. His son was no longer his own man. Then came the phone call that cut deep. Anna's voice came through the receiver, warm as always. "Dad, I've been thinking, maybe I should fly out sooner than planned. I just want to make sure everything's okay." George opened his mouth to reassure her, but before he could, Sophia's voice chimed in from across the room, loud enough for Anna to hear through the line. "He's not been doing well," Sophia said smoothly. "Forgets things, misplaces documents. Don't worry, though, we're handling it." George froze. "That's not true," he snapped, but Anna's silence told him she had heard enough to worry. "Dad," Anna said carefully, "just promise me you'll keep all your papers safe, okay? I'll come as soon as I can." George clenched the phone jaw tight. "I will. Don't you worry about me." When the call ended, he sat in his chair staring at the walls. Sophia passed by, smiling faintly as if nothing had happened, but George felt stripped, exposed. To Anna, he had sounded like a man losing his grip, and Sophia had planted that seed deliberately. That night, George wandered the house in darkness. His hand traced the grooves in the wooden banister, the chips in the kitchen tiles, the photographs that lined the hallway. Every scar of the house was a piece of his life carved from sweat and endurance. He thought of the winter storms when the roof nearly caved, the summers. He patched cracks with his bare hands, the years he worked himself raw just to keep these walls standing. Back in 2008, George had learned what desperation truly meant. He remembered walking into a hardware store, hat in hand, asking the manager if there was any work even sweeping floors. The man looked him over, shrugged and offered minimum wage. George swallowed his pride. That night he scrubbed grease off concrete until his knees ached, then headed straight to his warehouse shift. He returned home after dawn, body trembling. But when he looked at the house silhouetted against the rising sun, he told himself it was worth it. Pride could be rebuilt. A home once lost could not. Mary was his partner in every battle. He remembered one rainy afternoon, water dripping from a leak in the roof. George was on the ladder tools, slipping in the storm, when Mary climbed up beside him with a bucket. "You can't do this alone," she insisted, holding the ladder steady. Later, soaked to the bone, they sat on the kitchen floor, laughing over mugs of instant coffee. Even in struggle, she made him feel rich. When her illness came, it stole her strength, but not her fire. "Keep the house, George," she whispered from her hospital bed, "so our children will always know where they came from." Her hand had been frail in his, but her words became stone in his chest. He thought often of how differently his children had grown. Anna, even as a girl, showed a gentleness that mirrored Mary's. She left sticky notes on his toolbox. "Don't forget lunch, Dad," or slipped drawings of him in a cape, calling him her hero. David, on the other hand, was restless, always chasing the next thrill. George indulged him baseball games, model kits, trips to the arcade, hoping to anchor him with the same love. But as years passed, David drifted too easily, swayed by voices stronger than his own. George wondered if in protecting him too much, he had raised a son unprepared to stand firm. Now, in the silence of the house, George replayed these memories like worn film reels, the laughter of children echoing down the hall, Mary's humming as she cooked, the pounding of his own heart as he raced to meet payment deadlines. He pressed his palm to the wall and spoke aloud, as if to all of them. "This house is my covenant. It belongs to both of you, Anna and David. No papers, no whispers, no schemes will change that." His voice trembled but grew stronger. "I bled for these bricks. I buried your mother's love in this soil, and I will not let it be stolen while I still draw breath." The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked among utility bills and grocery coupons. George tore the envelope absent-mindedly, expecting another reminder from the county about property taxes. But as his eyes scanned the words, his breath caught. The deed to his house, the house he had fought his whole life to protect, was no longer in his name. According to official records, ownership had been transferred to David and Sophia Miller. George read it 3 times, the black print swimming on the page. His hands shook so violently the paper nearly slipped through his fingers. This can't be right," he muttered to himself. He checked the date, the case number, the seal. All authentic. The county office had recognized the quitclaim deed. His house, valued near $900,000, had been given away as if his lifetime of sacrifice was nothing but a signature. But he had never signed. He rushed to his drawer, pulling out the neat folder where he kept every important document. The original deed, the mortgage satisfaction notice, his will, all were there untouched. No quitclaim, no agreement. He sank into his chair, the letter trembling in his grip. Rage boiled beneath his confusion. Someone had done this to him, and the circle of suspects was small. That evening, George called David and Sophia over. He placed the letter squarely on the table, his jaw clenched. "Explain this," he demanded. David stared at the paper, his eyes flicking nervously to Sophia. She reached first, scanning the letter with a cool expression, then setting it down as though she had expected it. "Dad, you signed this weeks ago," she said lightly. "Maybe you don't remember." George slammed his palm on the table. "I never signed a damn thing." David shifted uncomfortably. "There was paperwork, with a notary. You said it was fine, that you wanted things to be simple." George's face reddened. "Simple to erase my name from my own house?" He turned to his son, searching for the boy who once clung to his hand at baseball games. "David, look at me. You know I never signed this." David's gaze dropped to his lap. "Maybe you just forgot, Dad." "Forgot," George barked out a bitter laugh. "I may be old, but I'm not senile. Don't you dare put that on me." Sophia leaned forward, her smile polite, her words cutting. "George, no one's accusing you of anything, but age can be tricky. You've misplaced things before. Remember the electric bill you left on the counter for weeks? We're only trying to protect the family's future." The words sliced deeper than any insult. Across the table, David's silence spoke volumes. He didn't defend his father. He didn't even flinch. The betrayal sat heavy in George's chest. That night, he phoned Anna. She answered breathlessly, still at work in New York. "Dad, everything okay?" "No, sweetheart, nothing's okay." His voice cracked as he told her about the letter, the supposed quitclaim, Sophia's smug insistence that he had simply forgotten. Anna gasped. "But that's impossible. Dad, you would never sign away the house." "I didn't." His words were firm, but exhaustion weighed on them. "They've forged something. They're trying to paint me as senile." On the other end, Anna's anger flared. "I'll book a flight. I'll come right away." George closed his eyes. "Don't. Not yet. Just keep this between us for now. I don't want you dragged into their lies." But even as he said it, he knew Sophia's poison was already spreading. The following days confirmed his fear. Neighbors approached him with concerned smiles. "We heard David's taking over things," Mrs. Rodriguez next door said kindly. "Probably for the best with your memory and all." Another neighbor asked if he'd thought about assisted living. George stood speechless, fury boiling inside him. Sophia had worked fast, weaving a narrative that left him defenseless. The confused old man whose children had to step in. The humiliation burned worse than anger. He had spent decades proving his strength, only to be cast as a burden overnight. George confronted David again, cornering him on the porch one evening. "Tell me the truth, son. Did you know about this deed?" David's lips parted, hesitation flashing in his eyes. For a moment, George thought he saw the boy he raised, desperate to confess. But then Sophia appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, her presence commanding. David's shoulders slumped. "Dad, it's done. Let's not fight about it anymore." George's heart cracked. His son's voice carried no conviction, only surrender. Days later, he marched to the county office himself. "There's been a mistake," he insisted to the clerk. She pointed him to the file. The quitclaim deed sat neatly recorded, stamped and notarized, and there it was, his signature bold and slanted. He traced the lines with his finger. The pen strokes looked eerily like his own, but he knew every curl of his name, and this was wrong. "This is a forgery," he growled. "I never wrote this." The clerk only shrugged. "You'll need to contest it legally, sir, but the record shows the notary confirmed it." Notary, the word clanged in George's head. A notary meant someone had stood in front of an official claiming to be him. His stomach turned. Who would dare that night? He sat in his dim kitchen, the forged signature seared into his mind. Anna called again. "Dad, I can't believe this. How could they think you'd forget something like that?" George's voice dropped to a whisper. "Because Sophia's making sure everyone believes it, even David." Anna's breath hitched. "Dad, listen to me. You're not crazy. You know what's real. We'll prove it. I promise." He clung to her words like a lifeline. But inside, doubt festered. What if the world believed Sophia over him? What if piece by piece they stripped him, not just of his home, but of his dignity? The breaking point came when George decided to confront the notary himself. He found the office downtown, a modest building with glass doors and sterile walls. Behind the counter, the notary, a middle-aged man in a pressed shirt, looked up as George approached. "I need to ask you something important." George began, his voice gravelly but steady. He slid the copy of the quitclaim across the counter. "Did you witness me signing this?" The notary examined the page, then nodded matter-of-factly. "Yes, sir. You sat right there at my desk. I confirmed your ID and your signature. Everything was in order." George felt the floor tilt beneath him. "That's impossible," he insisted. "I was at my doctor's appointment that day. I never came here." The notary frowned, but his tone remained firm. "I remember you. Gray hair, glasses, heavy jacket. You signed in front of me. I even stamped it myself." George's pulse roared in his ears. If the notary believed he'd seen him, what hope was left? Either the man was lying or someone had impersonated him convincingly. Either way, the legal record now bore authority against him. He left the office with his fists clenched, a storm raging inside. Back home, David and Sophia were waiting. Sophia greeted him sweetly as if nothing were amiss. "How did it go?" "George, did you get clarity?" George thrust the document at them. "That notary swears I was there, says I signed it myself." Sophia's brows arched in mock concern. "Well, there you have it. Maybe you really don't remember. It happens at your age." David shifted uneasily. "Dad, maybe it's better this way. Less stress for you. We'll take care of the house." George's fury erupted. "This house is mine. I bled for every brick, every shingle. Don't you dare tell me I don't remember." His voice cracked as he pointed at David. "And you know damn well I never signed anything?" David's lips trembled, but Sophia's hand on his arm silenced him. He stared at the floor, unable to meet his father's eyes. News of the deed spread further. Church acquaintances offered sympathetic smiles. Old friends avoided his gaze. George overheard whispers at the grocery store. It's sad when they lose their memory like that. His reputation, his credibility, everything he had built was unraveling. He felt like a ghost in his own life, dismissed by the very people who once respected him. Each night he sat in the living room surrounded by shadows, asking himself if he was truly alone in this fight. The loneliness pressed like a weight. He longed for Mary's voice, for her steady hand reminding him he wasn't crazy. All he had now was Anna's voice on the phone reminding him to hold on. One evening, Anna said softly, "Dad, you have to keep every receipt, every appointment slip, anything that proves where you were. If they forged your signature, there has to be a way to prove it." George swallowed hard. "I'll try. But what if no one believes me?" "They will," Anna said fiercely. "I believe you, and soon everyone else will too." Her faith steadied him, but only barely. Each day felt like wading deeper into a storm. The betrayal gnawed at him, not just Sophia's scheming, but David's silence. His own son, who once shouted with joy at baseball games, now stood mute as his wife stole the family's legacy. That silence hurt worse than any forged signature. Weeks passed. George noticed how Sophia maneuvered with ease, speaking to neighbors, managing David's paperwork, even answering George's mail before he could see it. She was weaving a cage around him bar by bar, until the man who once stood unbroken felt cornered in his own house. Finally, one night, George spoke aloud to the empty room. "Mary, I don't know how much longer I can fight this." His voice trembled, his body sagged. "They're taking everything we built, and no one believes me." The silence offered no answer, but the walls themselves seemed to echo his despair. If your own children stood silent while others stole from you, would you fight or would you give up? George wasn't sure how much longer he could resist. He felt the weight of years pressing down, the certainty of the world's judgment crushing him. And yet deep inside a spark of defiance still flickered. This was his house, his legacy. He hadn't survived decades of labor and loss just to surrender to lies. But in this moment, isolated, ridiculed, betrayed, he feared the battle might already be lost. George returned to the notary's office a second time, determined to catch some detail he had missed. The lobby was brightly lit with the sterile smell of carpet cleaner. People shuffled in and out, signing forms, barely noticing the trembling old man at the counter. George approached the notary again, this time with his medical receipt in hand. "Look here," he said, voice cracking. "On the date you claim I was here, I was across town at the doctor's office. How could I be in two places at once? The nota—" That night, Anna called again, her voice tight with anger. "Dad, this is fraud. They're gaslighting you. You have to fight." George sighed. "Sweetheart, how can I—" "The notary swears it was me. The neighbors believe Sophia. Even David." His throat closed around the name. "Don't give up." Anna urged. "We'll find proof. Maybe security cameras, maybe the hospital logs. Please, Dad, don't let them win." Her passion warmed him, but the gulf between them felt vast. She was hundreds of miles away, full of fee. Meanwhile, inside David's mind, conflict raged. He remembered the day Sophia brought the forged papers to him, telling him it was just a precaution. He remembered her insisting, "Your dad won't live forever. If we don't act now, the house could end up tangled in probate. This is for us, for our children." David had hesitated, staring at the lines of ink that pretended to be his father's hand. He knew it was wrong. But Sophia's eyes were relentless, her words dripping with certainty. And David always The betrayal spread like wildfire through their small community. At church, Father Collins patted George's shoulder gently. "We all forget things sometimes, my son. Maybe trust your children to handle things." George wanted to shout that it was all a lie, but the pitying look silenced him. In the grocery store, two women whispered near the canned goods aisle. That poor man. His mind must be slipping. George heard them, and the shame stung worse than the arthritis in his knees. Even old friends turn. One night after another humiliating day, George sat by the fireplace staring at the cold ashes. His voice trembled as he spoke into the empty room. "Mary, I've failed. They've taken our home. Even David doesn't believe me. What am I fighting for?" His hands covered his face, shoulders shaking. For the first time, he wondered if surrender might be easier. Perhaps letting Sophia have her way would end the torment. The thought shamed him, but exhaustion pressed harder than pride. He fell asleep in that sea. George sat in his armchair staring into the dim silence of his living room. The shadows of the evening stretched across the floorboards, making the house feel cavernous, almost hostile. For the first time in his life, he felt like a stranger in his own home. The whispers of neighbors, the looks of pity from church, the cold dismissal from officials, all of it echoed in his mind. To the world, he was no longer George Miller, the man who had worked his whole life to secure this house. He was just another old man slipping into confusion. The humiliation stung deeper than any physical pain. His calloused hands, once strong enough to lift beams and rebuild walls, now trembled when holding a pen. Every glance in the mirror felt like an accusation. He whispered to his reflection, "Am I really losing it? Or are they just trying to make me believe I am?" The doubt itself was a cruelty one that Sophia had planted, carefully watered by David's silence. In the quiet, memories of Mary surged forward. He could almost hear her laughter in the kitchen, smell the stew she used to simmer on Sundays. He closed his eyes and remembered the day they patched the roof together, both drenched in rain, laughing as if the storm was a joke. "We'll always make it through, George," she had said, pressing her hand over his heart. Her words had carried him through foreclosure threats, layoffs, even her illness. And now in his lowest moment he longed for her more than ever. He could see her face the day she gave him her final request. "Keep the house safe," she had whispered, "so our children will always know where they belong." George clenched his fists. Had he failed her? Had he let David's weakness and Sophia's greed undo everything they had built together? The thought twisted like a knife. "I promised you, Mary," he murmured to the silence. "I promised, and I don't break my promises." His gaze drifted to the family photos still hanging on the walls. In one, Anna, at 8 years old, held up a lopsided birthday cake she had baked herself. Her smile radiated pride, frosting smeared across her cheeks. In another, David, no more than 10, clutched a baseball mitt with eyes wide from catching his first fly ball. George reached out and touched the frame, his finger tracing the outline of his son's face. "Where did you go, David?" he whispered. "How did we end up here?" The betrayal cut deepest. Not because of Sophia's scheming, but because of David's silence. A son's silence, George realized, could be sharper than a knife. If David had shouted, if he had argued, at least it would mean he still cared. But his quiet compliance, his bowed head in the shadow of his wife, felt like abandonment in its cruelest form. George wondered if David even remembered those Dodger games, the late nights fixing model cars, the lessons about standing tall. "Did none of it matter to you?" he asked aloud, his voice breaking. When the phone rang that evening, George's heart lifted at the sight of Anna's name. Her voice was warm, though laced with worry. "Dad, I hate being so far away. I feel like I should have been there to stop this. You've done more from across the country than anyone here has," George told her, his throat tightening. "Your words keep me alive, Anna. I'll come soon," she promised. "Even if it costs me my job, I'll come. You shouldn't face this alone." Tears burned George's eyes. Gratitude mixed with sorrow. How was it that the child farthest from him was the one holding him closest, while the son who lived just minutes away had become a stranger? "You're all I have left," he said softly. "You and your mother's memory." "Don't talk like that," Anna insisted. "You still have me, and you still have this house. We'll prove the truth, Dad. I know it." Her conviction sparked a faint ember inside him. He looked around the room again this time, seeing not just the emptiness but the history etched into every surface. The scratches on the banister from when the kids slid down in socks. The dent in the wall where David once threw a ball too hard. The faded crayon marks Anna had made on her bedroom wall. These imperfections were not flaws, they were proof of life, proof of love. To let them be stolen would be to let his entire life vanish. He rose slowly, gripping the edge of the armchair for balance. The room seemed to breathe with him, as if waiting for his decision. His heart still ached with doubt, but beneath it, a stubborn resolve stirred. Sophia wanted him to surrender, to accept the role of the confused old man. David's silence begged him to retreat, but Mary's voice, Anna's faith, and his own blood and sweat refused to let him quit. He spoke aloud, as if to the house itself. "I may have lost my dignity in their eyes. They may call me forgetful, confused, even broken. But I will not lose this house, Not while I'm still breathing. Is silence strength, or is it weakness? What would you choose if your family's honor was on the line? George sat back down calmer now. The despair had not vanished, but something else had replaced it. A thin thread of determination. He didn't yet know how he would fight or what evidence could prove the forgery. But he knew one thing with certainty. The promise he had made to Mary still stood. And for that promise, he would rise again. His reflection was no longer one of defeat, but of a man gathering his strength for the storm to come. George closed his eyes and let the silence pull him back into memory. He saw Mary sitting on the back porch during the hardest year of their lives, her hands raw from scrubbing floors at her part-time job, his shirt soaked in sweat after another double shift. He had told her then, maybe we should give up, sell the house, start over somewhere smaller. But Mary had shaken her head fiercely. George, this isn't just wood and nails. It's proof that we can survive anything. If we give this up, we give up who we are. Her words had been a torch in the darkness, and they burned in his chest even now. When he thought of his children, the ache deepened. Anna, with her steady calls, her constant reminders that he mattered, lived 3,000 miles away, yet felt closer than his own heartbeat. David, who lived only minutes away, seemed lost behind Sophia's shadow. How could distance bring loyalty, while proximity bred betrayal? It was a question that gnawed at him, one he could not answer. He whispered into the emptiness, "Anna, you are the daughter every father hopes for." "David, why have you abandoned me?" The house creaked in response like an old friend leaning closer. George laid a hand against the wall, feeling the cool plaster under his palm. "I may be old. I may be tired. But I'm not finished," he said aloud. His voice grew stronger with each word. "Mary, you asked me to protect this house. Anna, you believe in me, and I will not surrender. They can take my name through lies, they can turn the neighbors against me, but I will fight until my last breath. Because this house is not just mine, it is ours. It is family, and I will not let them erase that." The knock on the door came just past sunrise. George shuffled to the entryway, heart heavy from another sleepless night. When he opened it, he froze. Anna stood there, suitcase at her side, eyes tired but fierce. She had flown overnight without telling him, determined to stand by his side. "Anna," George's voice broke. He reached out, pulling her into a trembling embrace. "You came. I told you I would," she whispered against his shoulder. "We're not going to let them erase you, Dad." For the first time in weeks, George felt the weight on his chest lift. With Anna physically beside him, the house didn't feel so empty, nor he so alone. Later that morning, they sat across from a lawyer in a small office stacked with case files. The man, graying at the temples, listened patiently as George explained what had happened. When George finished, the lawyer leaned back, fingers steepled. "It's an uphill battle," he admitted. "Courts place enormous trust in notaries. If the document bears a valid stamp, judges are inclined to accept it." George's shoulders sagged. "So that's it, I've already lost." "Not necessarily," the lawyer continued, "but you'll need more than your word. You'll need evidence that proves you couldn't have signed." Anna leaned forward, determination etched across her face. "We have it. He was at a doctor's appointment the very day this so-called signature happened." George nodded slowly. "I kept the receipts, even the hospital log." The lawyer raised a brow. "That's good, very good. But understand, opposing counsel will argue memory is unreliable. They'll try to spin it as an old man confusing dates. We need something indisputable." George's brief hope faltered. Once again the system seemed tilted against him. "They'll never believe me," he muttered. "Not over a stamped page." Anna reached across the desk, gripping his hand. "Dad, we're not giving up. Mom wouldn't want us to. You taught me that promises mean something." That afternoon they combed through George's files at the kitchen table. Bills, receipts, appointment cards, every slip of paper Mary had once nagged him to keep. "See," Anna said, laying out the hospital invoice. "Dated exactly the same day. You were in the waiting room, not at the notary." George touched the paper reverently as if it were a shield. "This is proof. This says I wasn't there." Anna smiled. "Yes, but like the lawyer said, it may not be enough." A week later, they returned to the lawyer's office with a stack of documents. The lawyer examined them carefully, nodding. "This helps, but we need more." He flipped through the county's file copy of the quit claim deed. "Look here," he said, pointing at the ID scan attached to the notary's record. "Does this number match your driver's license?" George pulled out his wallet, fumbling slightly as he handed over his card. The lawyer compared them. His eyes widened. "They don't match. Not even close." George leaned forward, squinting. "What do you mean? The license number on this scanned ID is wrong. Someone used a fake driver's license in your name. This isn't just a forgery, it's fraud." For a moment, silence filled the room. George stared at the paper, the realization dawning. Someone had impersonated him so thoroughly that even a notary had been fooled. His anger flared hot, burning away weeks of humiliation. "So I was right all along," he whispered. "They lied. They stole my name." Anna squeezed his arm. "This changes everything," the lawyer nodded firmly. "It does. A fraudulent ID undermines the entire notarization. If we can show this to a judge, that deed won't hold." George sat back, overcome. A spark ignited in his chest where despair had lived for too long. He thought of Mary's voice, her plea to protect their home. He thought of Anna's faith, of the neighbors' whispers calling him senile. Now he had proof that he wasn't the confused old man they thought. He was the victim of a calculated crime. That night he stood in the living room with Anna beside him. The house glowed softly in the lamplight, the walls lined with decades of memories. "Mary," he whispered, staring at her photograph. "I will fight this, all the way." For the first time, his voice did not waver. "What would you do if someone used your name and face to steal your life? Would you fight in court or let it go?" Anna placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll go back to court. We'll show them the truth." The lawyer outlined their plan, subpoena the notary, present the hospital records, and expose the fraudulent ID. They would build a case piece by piece until the lies collapsed. George listened, his spine straightening, his resolve hardening. No longer was he the victim waiting to be dismissed. He was a man preparing to take back what was his. As they left the office, George paused on the sidewalk, looking up at the sky. The burden of despair still lingered, but hope had returned. The fight was far from over, but for the first time he felt ready. The storm was coming, and he would meet it head on. The courtroom was heavy with silence as George and Anna took their seats beside the lawyer. George's hands trembled slightly on the table, but his eyes were steady. Today would decide whether he was a man robbed of his dignity or simply forgotten as a confused old man. The judge adjusted his glasses, announcing the case for review. On the other side, David sat with his head low, while Sophia stared straight ahead, calm and sharp as a blade. The lawyer presented the hospital records first. "On the DAT," the tension snapped when the lawyer introduced the final piece, the bank's digital log. "Your Honor, the quitclaim deed was submitted electronically from the Miller residence, not from Mr. Miller's computer. The IP address matches David Miller's home network." Gasps erupted. David buried his face in his hands. Sophia's jaw tightened, but her eyes stayed cold. "Call the notary," the judge ordered. The man shuffled to the stand, sweat beading at his brow. A screen flickered on, playing security footage. The gallery exploded with noise. George gripped Anna's hand, tears sliding down his cheeks. The judge banged the gavel for order. "This deed is suspended. Further investigation into fraud will proceed. For now, the property reverts to George Miller." Relief flooded George, but Sophia's glare never wavered. Even as officers approached her for questioning, she turned once toward George, eyes burning with defiance. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. George sat frozen as the footage ended. For weeks he had been branded forgetful, even senile, but now the truth glared back at everyone. The whispers that once pitied him turned into gasps of outrage. A neighbor in the gallery covered her mouth, whispering, "It was her all along." Father Collins bowed his head in shame. George's chest swelled, not with triumph but with vindication. At last he was seen. Yet even as relief coursed through him, Sophia's eyes never softened. They locked on his, promising that this fight was only beginning. Family isn't built on lies or greed, it's built on love, sacrifice, and respect. George almost lost everything to betrayal inside his own home, but the truth came out in the end. What about you? Have you ever seen a family torn apart by money or by silence? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below. If this story moved you, please give it a like. Share it with someone who would feel the same, and don't forget to subscribe to Echoes of Betrayal for more stories where truth fights back against betrayal. Your support helps us bring more voices, more families, and more justice to light. Thank you for watching.